Hello, Croiso Fulcher. Welcome back to the channel, Old Boy here, and today we are continuing to look into the sources which mention the Pelasgians. In the last 3 episodes we looked at the sources which show their connections to places which we would consider today to be parts of ancient Greece as well as Italy, and today we're going to look at the sources which connect them to the islands of the Aegean as well as Asia Minor. So with all that being said, let's get into it. In the Iliad, Homer lists a contingent of Pelasgians among the allies of the Trojans, where they are described as Dioi Pelasgoi. Dioi being a word which can mean heavenly, noble, or divine. Quote, "To the seaward lie the Carians, the Paeonian bowmen, the Leleges, the Cauconians, and the noble Pelasgi." End quote. We learn from the text that the leader of these tribes of Pelasgian spearmen was a man named Hippothous, who is described as being of the race of Ares. The text states he was a native of fertile Larissa, which isn't necessarily the name of a single location, which we will come on to later. Quote, "Hippothous led the tribes of Pelasgian spearmen, who dwelt in fertile Larissa. Hippothous and Pulaios of the race of Ares, 2 sons of the Pelasgian Lethus, son of Teutomus." End quote. Later in the text, Hippothous is killed by Ajax in the battle for the body of Patroclus. Here we are told that Hippothous is killed far away from his home in Larissa. Quote, "At this moment, Hippothous, brave son of the Pelasgian Lethus, in his zeal for Hector and the Trojans, was dragging the body off by the foot through the press of the fight, having bound a strap round the sinews near the ankle. But a mischief soon befell him, from which none of those could save him who would have gladly done so. For the son of Telamon sprang forward and smote him on his bronze-cheeked helmet. The plumed headpiece broke about the point of the weapon, struck at once by the spear and by the strong hand of Ajax, so that the bloody brain came oozing out through the crest socket. His strength then failed him, and he let Patroclus's foot drop from his hand as he fell full length dead upon the body. Thus he died far from the fertile land of Larissa, and never repaid his parents the cost of bringing him up, for his life was cut short early by the spear of mighty Ajax." End quote. Homer also mentions a group of Pelasgians in the Odyssey, who are described as one of the 5 tribes which inhabit Crete. In the passage, Homer once again calls them Dioi Pelasgoi. Quote, "There is a fair and fruitful island in mid-ocean called Crete. It is thickly peopled, and there are 9 cities in it. The people speak many different languages which overlap one another, for there are Achaeans, brave Eteocretans, Dorians of threefold race, and noble Pelasgi. There is a great town there, Knossos, where Minos reigned, who every 9 years had a conference with Zeus himself." End quote. Strabo comments on the passages in the Iliad, stating that the number of Pelasgians present during the Trojan War must have been considerable, as Homer doesn't just mention a singular tribe. He also makes comments on Hippothous and the mention of him dying far from Larissa, saying that there were numerous places which had that name. He describes a Larissa near Hamaxitus, which was an ancient city in the southwest of the Troad region, but notes that it was very near to Ilium, a distance of some 200 stadia, and therefore concludes that this could not be the Larissa that Homer mentioned. He next mentions a town named Larissa in the territory of Ephesus on the Ionian coast, but concludes that this too could not be the correct location. Strabo therefore assumes the home of these Pelasgians who were led by Hippothous to be the Larissa near Cumae, a city which was located in Aeolis, a region which was comprised of the west and northwestern regions of Asia Minor. Quote, By these words, Homer clearly indicates that the number of Pelasgians was considerable, for he says tribes, not tribe, and he also specifies their abode as in Larissa. Now there are many Larissas, but we must interpret him as meaning one of those that were near, and best of all, one might rightly assume the one in the neighbourhood of Cumae. For of the three Larissas, the one near Hamaxitus was in plain sight of Ilium and very near it, within a distance of 200 stadia, and therefore it could not be said with plausibility that Hippothous fell in the fight over Patroclus far away from this Larissa, but rather from the Larissa near Cumae, for the distance between the two is about 1,000 stadia. The third Larissa is a village in the territory of Ephesus in the Caister plain. It is said to have been a city in earlier times, containing a sanctuary of Larissan Apollo, and being situated closer to Mount Tmolus than to Ephesus. It is 180 stadia distant from Ephesus, and might therefore be placed under the Myonians. But the Ephesians, having grown in power, later cut off for themselves much of the territory of the Myonians, whom we now call Lydians, so that this could not be the Larissa of the Pelasgians either, but rather the one near Cumae. In fact, we have no strong evidence that the Larissa in the Caister plain was already in existence at the time, for we have no such evidence as to Ephesus either, but all Aeolian history, which arose but shortly after the Trojan times, bears testimony to the existence of the Larissa near Cumae." End quote. It's also worth noting that Strabo also mentions many other places called Larissa, and the name may have a connection to the Pelasgians, as Larissa was, of course, the name of a nymph who was the daughter of Pelasgus after all. Other than the sources which connect some of these regions to the Pelasgians, the lexicographers also pick up on this, and in a dictionary of Greek and Roman geography, William Smith writes, quote, "This name Larissa probably signifies a fortress built on a precipice or overhanging rock, and is an indication, wherever it occurs, of the presence of Pelasgi." End quote. This notion is also reflected in the LSJ Greek lexicon, which under the entry for Larissa states, quote, "Larissa, a name of many old Greek cities, Pelasgic according to Strabo. Originally it denoted a citadel, such as the Larissa of Argos." End quote. We will expand on this thread in a future video. Strabo also tells us, via an account from Menocrates of Elaia, that the Ionian coast of Asia Minor, as well as the neighbouring islands, were originally inhabited by Pelasgians. In addition to this, he also names Lesbos as an island which he says was under the command of a Pelasgian ruler who was named Pelias. The account also goes on to say that the island of Chios was also founded by the Pelasgians from Thessaly. Quote, "That the Pelasgians were a great tribe is said also to be the testimony of history in general. Menocrates of Elaia, at any rate, in his work on the founding of cities, says that the whole of what is now the Ionian coast, beginning at Mucale, as also the neighbouring islands, were in earlier times inhabited by Pelasgians. But the Lesbians say that their people were placed under the command of Pelias, the man whom the poet calls the ruler of the Pelasgians, and that it is from him that the mountain in their country is still called Pelias. The Chians also say that the Pelasgians from Thessaly were their founders." End quote. The notion that the Ionians were originally Pelasgians is also shared by Herodotus. In the following passage, he says that before the time when Danaos and Xuthos came to the Peloponnesus, the Ionians who lived there were known as the Pelasgians of the coastland. He also seems to corroborate the account given by Strabo, which says the inhabitants who settled on the islands neighbouring the Ionian coast were also originally Pelasgians. Quote, The Ionians furnished 100 ships and were equipped like Hellenes. Now the Ionians, so long time as they dwelt in the Peloponnese, in the land which is now called Achaia, and before the time when Danaos and Xuthos came to the Peloponnese, were called, as the Hellenes report, Pelasgians of the coastland, and then Ionians after Ion, the son of Xuthos. The islanders furnished 17 ships and were armed like Hellenes, this also being a Pelasgian race, though afterwards it came to be called Ionian by the same rule as the Ionians of the 12 cities who came from Athens." End quote. Herodotus goes on to tell us that the Aeolians who had settled on the western coast of Asia Minor were also Pelasgian in origin, stating that when they fought against the Greeks, they wore Greek armour. Quote, "The Aeolians furnished 60 ships and were equipped like Greeks. Formerly, they were called Pelasgian as the Greek story goes." End quote. Herodotus also tells us that the city of Antandros, also in the Troad region, was originally a Pelasgian city, as were Plakiae and Skulakae. In addition to this, Herodotus states that the Pelasgians also used to inhabit Samothrace, and that the Samothracian mysteries were actually Pelasgian in origin. Now this is interesting when we consider the sources which we looked at in the last 2 episodes, which stated that the Lupercalia and the Saturnalia were also rites of a Pelasgian origin. Quote, "It was not so with the Ithyphallic images of Hermes. The production of these came from the Pelasgians, from whom the Athenians were the first Greeks to take it, and then handed it on to others. For the Athenians were then already counted as Greeks when the Pelasgians came to live in the land with them, and thereby began to be considered as Greeks. Whoever has been initiated into the rites of the Kabeiroi, which the Samothracians learned from the Pelasgians and now practice, understands what my meaning is. Samothrace was formerly inhabited by those Pelasgians who came to live among the Athenians, and it is from them that the Samothracians take their rites. The Athenians, then, were the first Greeks to make Ithyphallic images of Hermes, and they did this because the Pelasgians taught them. The Pelasgians told a certain sacred tale about this, which is set forth in the Samothracian mysteries." End quote. As a side note, this translation refers to the practices as rites, but the original Greek uses the term ta orgia, which is cognate with the English word orgy. Dionysius of Halicarnassus tells us that the Pelasgians originally came from the Peloponnesus before moving to Thessaly. Here they are described as being driven out of Thessaly by various tribes who were commanded by Deucalion, and upon their dispersal, some of them fled to the island of Crete, others to the Cyclades, as well as some who passed over into Asia Minor and occupied the coastal regions along the Hellespont. In the account, they are also described as inhabiting many of the adjacent islands, including the Isle of Lesbos, which gets a particular mention, where they are said to have joined forces with an earlier group of colonists. This final point also seems to align with the quote which we looked at earlier from Strabo, which mentioned that the people of Lesbos were commanded by a king of the Pelasgians. Quote, "And dispersing themselves in their flight, some went to Crete, others occupied some of the islands called the Cyclades, some settled in the region called Hestiaiotis, near Olympus and Ossa. Others crossed into Boeotia, Phocis and Euboea, and some, passing over into Asia, occupied many places on the coast along the Hellespont, and many of the adjacent islands, particularly the one now called Lesbos, uniting with those who composed the first colony that was sent there from Greece under Macar, the son of Crinacus." End quote. Diodorus Siculus also seems to corroborate the accounts which say that the Pelasgians once inhabited Crete and Lesbos. In the account, he says that the Pelasgians, who were in a state of continuous expedition and migration, settled in Crete and made part of the island their home. Quote, "But now that we have examined these matters, it remains for us to discuss the peoples who have become intermixed with the Cretans. That the first inhabitants of the island were known as Eteocretans, and that they are considered to have sprung from the soil itself, we have stated before. And many generations after them, Pelasgians, who, as they were in a movement by reason of their continuous expeditions and migrations, arrived at Crete and made their home in a part of the island." End quote. Concerning Lesbos, Diodorus gives a slightly different account to the one which was conveyed by Dionysius. Here, we are told that Xanthus, the son of Triopas, chief of the Pelasgi from Argos, first settled in Lycia, and afterwards crossed over with his followers into Lesbos, which, according to the account, was uninhabited at the time. This was 7 generations before the flood of Deucalion. Quote, "Now that we have discussed the subject of Crete at sufficient length, we shall undertake at this point to speak about Lesbos. This island has been inhabited in ancient times by many peoples, since it has been the scene of many migrations. The first people to seize it, while it was still uninhabited, were the Pelasgians, and in the following manner. Xanthus, the son of Triopas, who was king of the Pelasgians of Argos, seized a portion of Lycia, and making his home there, at the outset he became king over the Pelasgians who had accompanied him. But later he crossed over to Lesbos, which was uninhabited, and divided the land among the folk, and he named the island, which had formerly been called Issa, Pelasgia, after the people who had settled it." End quote. Finally, in addition to the islands of Lemnos and Imbros, which we have already covered in the last episode due to their Terranian connections, we are told by Scumnos of Chios that a group of Pelasgians came out of Thrace and settled the islands of Skouros and Skiathos. So that's going to conclude our look at the Pelasgians in Asia Minor and the Aegean Islands. We have now collected a list from the classical sources of all the locations which the Pelasgians were said to inhabit, covering the regions which are considered today to be Italy, Greece, the Aegean Islands, as well as Asia Minor. Over the next few episodes, I aim to expand on the Larissa connections, and will present an analysis of the information in an attempt to piece together a fuller picture of the Pelasgians from the clues which we have found in the texts. Thanks to everyone who watches and supports me in the channel, it's much appreciated. Please do remember to let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and as always, I'll catch you on the next one. Old Boy, out.